Hello, class. This is going to be a shorter lecture. I know, sorry, you're very disappointed about that. But just going to hit on a few basics with freshwater issues here. And I want to start off with talking about, and your book lists these out, some of the things that make freshwater really unique in our world. So the status of water really has a unique role in terms of how the functions that it plays for human society. For one, it's absolutely essential. Life could not exist without water. And so more so than many other things, there are many food products that you can say, well, without that, I could have a different food product, or without wood, I could build with bricks, or, take your pick resource. There are ways around that generally, the one exception being water. I guess maybe the other one maybe being oxygen, but water is critical and necessary for life. It's non-substitutable. There's nothing you can substitute for it. Only water will work for meeting that human need. It is finite. There certainly is a lot of it in the world, but a lot of it's in unusable forms. A lot of it is in salt water or frozen in ice caps. And it is in limited supply. And in some places, its supply is more limited than in others. And that matters as well. And it's a complex system. So water impacts temperature, it impacts the climate in particular regions around the world, it impacts the climate on a global scale, it distributes heat around the planet in important ways, it enables a number of ecosystem services. And as I mentioned before, it's distributed variably across the world. So the water system, the hydrosphere, is really complex. And so it's not as simple, for example, as food production. We can ship food pretty readily across, well, I'm getting into my next one here, but we can ship food pretty easily across the world. But water is not as easy to do that because it's just the quantities we need it in. It's not super transportable over long distances. It can be transported over long distances, but not to any meaningful degree where you can really solve water access problems by long distance water transportation. That's not super feasible to do. And your book doesn't mention, it mentions those five, doesn't mention this, which seems odd, but it is an open access resource. Just like we talked about with the atmosphere, water is a critical open access resource for human survival, and one that people can't be excluded from tapping into an aquifer, from using a river or a lake for water resource. And the more that it's polluted by human use, the more degraded it becomes for everyone else. So it is an open access resource. So there's a whole lot of things that make water particularly unique and important, that makes it unlike any other commodity. Water is not just like other commodities like oil or wood or corn. It's very different, uniquely different among everything else. So I'm going to get to this question about, is water a fundamental human right or a universal human right? But first, let's start with this question. What are some basic examples of human rights? So pause the video and write down a few things that you can think of that you feel like might qualify as a fundamental or universal human right. So just a definition, universal human rights or fundamental human rights are basic rights and freedoms belonging to all human beings, regardless of race, age, gender, etc. These are rights and freedoms that everybody has a right to, that are generally recognized on the global scale, that yes, all humans have a right to this. In other words, there is a moral charge to ensure its availability to all humans, that all humans have a moral charge to make sure that other humans have that right, and that anything that deprives other humans of that right is fundamentally wrong and should be prevented or punished for transgressing that boundary. And often it's worth noting, human rights require protection or provision from the government. So we have seen many times how human rights have been transgressed throughout history. And therefore, government has a critical role to play in protecting human rights or providing for human rights. Take, for example, slavery. For many years, most people can generally consider that freedom from slavery is a fundamental human right. Well, it's not always been the case where that was considered such, and slavery was something that of course played a significant role in the past in our country and globally, and still does today in many other places as well. There are still tens of millions of people enslaved around the world today, in hiding typically, away from the public's eye, but still there. And in order to abolish that in our country, it required government involvement in that. And then to go further, to provide the fundamental rights of being able to vote, of being able to be treated equally under the law, through all of the segregation and civil rights era, that required government involvement to make those steps. So human rights have to be protected by the government. Just some examples of that. And you can find a list, look up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a UN document that the nations agreed to. It lists 30 different human rights, includes just a few examples here: life, freedom of life, freedom from slavery, a right to an education, a right to be able to assemble, equal treatment under the law. So there's a lot of different human rights. And interestingly, as your book points out, there's not really anywhere where there is a universal right to water access that is generally considered in any kind of international convention. Your book lists a couple examples where it's mentioned under particular scenarios, like for children or for prisoners of war. And then in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it does say that humans have a right to standard of living adequate for health and well-being. And interestingly, it includes food, clothing, housing, but it doesn't include water there, which is an interesting omission to that. So it's, is this a fundamental human right or not? That is a question that's open for public debate. And so far, it doesn't seem to be that water access is recognized as such, even though, as we talked about, water is so unique among the rest of the things of the world, and it's fundamental, even more so than freedom from slavery. Access to water is a necessity to survive. You can still survive and be enslaved, and your quality of life is not going to be good. And slavery, of course, is an abomination. But the point being that there's an argument to be made that access to water is even more fundamentally important than being guaranteed a right to freedom from slavery. So that's an interesting dynamic. Is water a fundamental human right? Well, what about what are the implications? So here's pause and answer this question. This might require a little bit of thought. Again, I'm only looking for a couple sentences here. I'm not looking for an essay. What would be the implications of water as a human right? You might have to think about that one for a minute, but try to think of what would that imply? What would that mean for the world, for our politics, for our actions, for the way we treat water, if that were the case? Hopefully you wrote down some interesting things there. Look forward to reading those. We're going to talk a little bit about privatization of water. Would water be privatized if it were a fundamental human right? Is there a precedent for privatizing something that's a human right? I would suggest probably not. So I think that question of is water a fundamental human right really has implications for the privatization case. And perhaps that's a part of why it's not recognized widely as a fundamental human right on the international scene, because a lot of international NGOs and IGOs are in favor of water privatization. So maybe that's a factor that pushes them towards seeing this as something different. Water as a human right would probably spur greater investment, greater government investment in water systems, which would certainly be a good thing. It seems like you wouldn't run into nearly as many problems that we have with water access if it was treated as a human right. So that's good. Might influence the outcome of certain conflicts. A lot of conflicts happen over water access, and this might influence how those play out on the global scene. Seems like it would probably prioritize domestic use over industry use if water was a fundamental human right, and in places where there's conflict, particularly in places where there's water shortage. So I think there's a lot of interesting implications to what that might look like. And it's important to note there's a lot of ways that our human rights are already limited. So yes, we have human rights, but that doesn't mean that they are unlimited human rights. So for example, they're not guaranteed to be free. So we may have access to water, but we're still expected to pay for it. Or it may be that access to food is a human right, but we're still going to pay for that food, right? They're not unlimited either. So we have a right to be free from slavery, but if you commit a crime, the government legally can lock you up, which is in some ways equivalent to being enslaved. And yet we as a society accept that as being part of the consequence for those actions. So rights are not unlimited, particularly when they begin to transgress on the rights of others to enjoy their human rights. So if your actions impinge on someone else's ability to live their life in a healthy and meaningful way, then there are consequences to that. And it might mean losing some of your rights as a consequence to that. And that could be the same thing with water as well. It could be, particular places with water stress, that you can't just have free and unlimited use of water for everyone who wants it, because that can quickly be abused. Again, tragedy of the commons. So there needs to be a limit to that in some way that considers the needs of everybody who would use that resource. So water must be constrained or controlled in some sense because it's an open access resource. So because anyone can use it, and the more people that use it, the more degraded it becomes, it must be constrained or controlled in some kind of sense. And the question arises of how best to do this. So one camp would say this can be done best through pricing, through market-based mechanisms, where allow markets to set the price for water, and that helps control through the market access. It helps control quality. Obviously, if it's bad quality, people aren't going to want to pay for it, and so then that creates a mechanism to adjust for that. Or you can constrain or control water access through government regulation, through government control of that. So these are kind of two different approaches. So let's ask this question then: how would you set an appropriate price if you're trying to set an appropriate price for government? Sorry, not for water access. If you're doing anything other than the government mandating how much water people are getting, then you have to evolve a price in some way. And even now, like in the US, most of our water supply is controlled by local governments, but there still is a price on that, right? So how do you set an appropriate price for water given its unique value? Pause this one and think about that for a second. So important to consider this question of how do you set an appropriate price? What is an appropriate price for water, particularly if it's fundamentally important for human society? Okay, let's look at a little bit. So where's the water? Obviously, the vast bulk, you've probably seen 97% of the water in the world is salt water, primarily in the oceans. And then of the 2.5% that's fresh water, most of that is frozen. So more than 2/3 of that 2.5% is frozen up in glaciers and ice caps. So it's only really about 1% of the world's water that is non-frozen fresh water. Now of that, most of that is groundwater underneath the ground, and only actually a small fraction. So only 1% of the 2.5%. So we're talking, what was that? 0.25, about 0.25% of the water in the world is surface freshwater. Of that, most of that is still frozen in permafrost, ground ice and permafrost. And then we have lakes and other ones. So the point being, most of the water in the world is not particularly accessible to us in terms of functional use for drinking or for irrigation or for meeting many of the needs that we have for that. Also interesting to note that the vast bulk of the surface freshwater lakes, 21%. So of that, 20% of the world's surface freshwater is actually in one lake, Lake Baikal in Russia, the deepest lake in the world. Another 20% is in the Great Lakes, right next door to where we live. And then about 25% is in the Rift Valley lakes in East Africa. So Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, and Lake Victoria. So fully 2/3 of the water from those lakes are in just a handful of lakes in some key spots. So that's of interest as well. Also, water access is regionally variable. So I mentioned this already, but this is worth spending a little bit of time on. And your book does point this out. So some places are flush with it. So if you look at, for example, much of Latin America, there is no lack of access to water on a country by country basis. Now, of course, within each country, it's regionally variable as well. So if you're in northern Chile in the Atacama Desert, where practically no rainfall falls, then yeah, there's a great water scarcity there. Or in the western coast of Peru, for example, it's a very dry region. So there's not a lot of water access there, but it's made up for it in terms of if you're shading the country color. The reason Peru is this dark blue is because it has a huge chunk of the Amazon in the east. So very dry in the west, but very wet in the east. Now, that doesn't mean that the country doesn't have water problems, because the city of Lima, Peru, which is on the coast in the west, the capital city, has a lot of water scarcity issues, particularly with glacial melt changing with global warming. That exacerbates these challenges. So there's still problems. Same thing with US. We're blue, which looks good, but vast chunks of the western US really struggle with drought as well. So it is very, very highly variable around the world. But as you can see, and your book shows the differences between stress, scarcity, and absolute scarcity. Obviously, the darker it's going there toward the red, then the less water is available. And some of these places that have real significant water scarcity are also places of concern for other reasons. So you look at the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula here. Well, there's a conflict that's been going on, and ethnic conflict in Yemen for many years. And undoubtedly, it's being driven by water scarcity. By lack of access to that is a major problem. A lot of extremism comes out of the Middle East. It doesn't help that these countries are really scarce on water. Syria had like a decade-long civil war that was in large part driven by extended droughts that caused conflict to erupt because people couldn't grow crops anymore. North Africa, East Africa, lots of problems. Look at, these are places where population is growing very rapidly as well. Same thing for Central Asia here. You have quickly growing populations of people, and places that already have scarce access to water. Also of note is that many of the places where water access is much more scarce are also some of the most vulnerable to climate change. So South Asia, for example, and Sub-Saharan Africa are places that are highly vulnerable to climate change. So when you combine these things together, you have many areas of the world that population is growing quickly. They are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts that are already impacting their country, and they already have significant water stress there. And it creates this trifecta of tension and stress around these issues. So here's the question I want you to answer. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. But what difficult realities might this point to for the future? So if you've got these regions where there's a whole lot of people and the population's growing, there's a whole lot of water stress already. So there's water stress, but the population's growing, and climate change is exacerbating those tensions and making them worse. So what difficult realities might that point to? As you can guess, yeah. So this increase, we're going to see increases in water scarcity. Places that are already scarce on water, if the population is growing rapidly, and if climate change is making that worse, then we're going to continue to see increases in water scarcity. You're going to see some of these orange and red places moving to darker red, and you're going to see more places moving to orange and red because that is how that tends to work. You're going to see more migration, more people movement. If you have a densely populated country like India or Pakistan, or like some of these countries in Africa, and it becomes more and more difficult for people to live because they can't get access to water or they can't grow crops, what do you think is going to happen? Of course, those people are going to migrate. They're going to move. So, but migration causes tension. So the more we see these problems with water scarcity, the more ethnic tension you have, the more migration you see, the more conflict's going to happen. And there's going to be impacts on food production. So you're going to see more hunger as well. So all of these things are tied in together. This lack of access to water that you see in many different places leads to a host of other conflicts and problems around the world. So the need to address that is really important as well. Another interesting thing that plays into this is that when you're talking about water scarcity, it's highly regional in nature. So if you live in Brazil, you have no water scarcity. There's plenty. Brazil is flush with water resources. Same thing for the Eastern United States. Water scarcity is not a problem in the Eastern United States. or in Canada. Interestingly, because water is not very transportable to some places, it makes it so that it's a little bit difficult to know how do you address a problem like this on an individual basis. So it doesn't actually help a whole lot for me to, for example, take shorter showers if I live in the Eastern United States. That's not going to help people facing water scarcity in sub-Saharan Africa because it doesn't increase their availability of water. Now, it is beneficial from the perspective of spending less energy heating that water, so that's a good thing. But in places where there's not water scarcity, water conservation isn't nearly as effective or important as it is in places where there is water. Now, if you live in Arizona, yeah, water conservation is really important because there's a lot of water scarcity that exists there. I hesitate to say that because I don't want people to think, oh, it doesn't matter how long of a shower I take. There are other reasons why it's good to conserve water and conserve energy from that, but it doesn't equate to helping out with the problem elsewhere in the world as well. What does help with that is being more open to refugees and migrants. That's of great value and helps with that problem. Your book only very briefly lists a few different types of water, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's helpful, I think, to distinguish between sort of water resources in different ways. Blue water being what we think of as surface or groundwater, lakes, rivers, aquifers. About 70% of blue water goes to agriculture. So right now, blue water is what we think of as normal water. Like this is when we think of water resources, freshwater resources, that's what comes to mind, like this top picture. And most of that in our society today goes to agriculture because a lot of water is needed to grow crops, and because there's a lot of people needing food, and because the increase in animal agriculture requires a whole lot more water to feed into that. So that adds to it. Some things related to blue water that can help with conserving or stewarding that well. Things like sustainable agriculture methods, eating more plant-based agriculture. Things like permeable pavements that allow water to filter into the ground rather than just running off toward the ocean. Green water is water embedded in plants and in soil. So it's not water in the sense of like looking at a puddle of water, but it's the moisture content in plants and in soil. It rejoins the water cycle through transpiration, which is the process of water going from plant matter directly into the atmosphere. And things like cover cropping, mulching, protecting soils, forests, and ecosystems help protect that green water. Now, if you remember back to our planetary boundaries discussion, it used to be that, so freshwater resources is one of the 9 planetary boundaries. And it used to be up until this year that was considered in the green, that we were fine on that. And that, yeah, there's freshwater issues, but on a planetary scale, it hadn't yet reached sort of crisis point. But for the first time this year, they separated out blue and green water. And what they found is that from a blue water perspective, we still have plenty of blue water in the world. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't places that have significant water scarcity issues, as we saw with this map. There are, for sure. But on a global scale, blue water wasn't a problem. However, when they started measuring green water, the amount of water sort of embedded into plants and soils, they found that on a global scale, we do have a shortage of that. And then that is problematic. So that's worth noting too. And then gray water, this is made by not water made by humans, but this is human source. So water contaminated with impurities or other forms of pollution that needs to be filtered out to become green or blue water. So contaminated water is how you can think of this. Water impacted by human activity that needs to be cleaned up. And most of that, we have some things that we can do through wastewater treatment plants that help with that. But most of that comes from natural processes. That, like the soil, for example, is a great filter, filtering out toxins from water to help purify it so that by the time it gets down to an aquifer, it has been cleaned up and is useful for human consumption and use. Also, a couple types of water pollution that are worth pointing out. Point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are exactly like what it sounds like. It has an identifiable source. So the factory, the pipe coming out of the factory, or the wastewater treatment plant. So these are specific places like this picture that you see here. This is a point source. This is where the pollution is entering the water system. and non-point sources. Non-point sources are things that are distributed, they're diffuse, it's runoff. So I think of spreading a bunch of fertilizer on cropland. Well, that with rain, some of that gets soaked into the ground and enters the plants, but some of that gets washed off with rain and to waterways. But where's the exact point that happens? It's not like it's all funneled through a pipe. It sort of washes off, or pollution that runs off from city streets, or from other developments. Animal feedlots, well, water, a lot of pathogens in animal manure, and that gets washed down into systems. But those are non-point sources. We have gotten really good, particularly in the United States, at regulating point source pollution, and have greatly reduced that to good effect of cleaning up our waterways. We have not done a good job of addressing non-point sources. And as you can imagine, it's much more difficult to address non-point sources of pollution. You can't just tell farmers don't spread fertilizer on your crops because it's a non-point source of pollution. Farmers need fertilizer. Now, are there other ways of doing fertilizer? We could talk about that as well. But yeah, the point being, it's a lot more difficult to regulate non-point sources of pollution because there's no one specific place to look for that. Or what about the pollution that comes from city streets, right? That sort of washes out. That's difficult. So there are things you can do, but it's a lot more complicated. All right, last thing I want to hit on. Your book has this really fascinating discussion about neoliberalism and water privatization. Now, with neoliberalism, what we're referring to here is a philosophy that prioritizes free market economics above everything else. So that when you hear the phrase neoliberal, that's what it means. It means that free markets reign. Now, I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, because you see that liberalism in there and you think, oh, that's probably big government thing. Actually, it's the opposite. Neoliberalism is where free markets reign, shifting from public services to private markets. So there is a trend, and a neoliberal trend of shifting towards water privatization. And some people point to potential advantages of that, such as markets tend to be more efficient than government resources. So from an economically efficient perspective, the free market tends to be more effective at that. So that's beneficial. It saves money for municipalities if they're not needing to pay for it. It's sufficient for addressing open access concerns. Remember, one of the ways you can address a tragedy common scenario is by privatizing something. So if you privatize a town's water supply, for example, then it's easier to, embedded into the management of that resource is the idea of sustainability, because the company that's managing that doesn't want to degrade the quality or quantity of the resource, because then that hits into their profits as well. So that's an argument for privatizing water, but a lot of concerns that come up with that as well. Is it ethically okay to make a profit off of a basic human right? If you're arguing that water is a basic human right, is it okay for private corporations to make a profit off of that? That seems unethical. And said, or what about equity concerns around haves and have-nots? Particularly, you can imagine the poorer sections of the city. What incentive would a private corporation have for providing them with water? Think of a slum in a part of the developing world. Why would a private company want to invest in putting a high quality clean water supply into a slum? There's no economic incentive for doing that. Whereas if it's a public utility, then the city has to do that. So that's a concern. The wealthy world has primarily public water supplies. And so in large part, they're subsidized, they're clean, they're effective. But many developing countries are being forced into private water supplies because the World Bank and the IMF, in order to get loans from those groups, which much of the less developed world relies upon, often a requirement is that they have private water supplies in place. For whatever reason, the World Bank and the IMF think that that's important. And so that pushes them towards that. But that can create a further disparity between the haves and have-nots, or quality concerns. Think about like the Flint water crisis, where a lot of residents of Flint, particularly in lower income and communities of color, were faced with degrading water quality and had significant problems with the quality of their water supply. Well, if you have a privatized water system, why would a private company invest in fixing that, invest lots of money in fixing that, when it's low income residents who aren't going to be able to afford the price of water that would come about if they did that. So that's particularly problematic. And there's no accountability because water supply is a monopoly. You're not going to have competing water systems in the same city. It's unrealistic. And so you're going to have a monopoly there. And with a monopoly, there's no accountability for holding things in check. Okay, I think we're going to stop at that. I know that was a shorter one. Hopefully still good. Thank you.